Okay, hello class. Welcome back once again. I'm Professor G, and today we're going to be picking up where we left off last time, and that is with our discussion of what I believe to be the two founding social institutions, social and political institutions of the early American government. So first of all, we talked about the foundation of slavery. Specifically speaking, we addressed why it is that Africans in particular were targeted. So they had a somewhat robust labor pool there. They could, at first you have indentured servants coming in, followed by Native Americans, the possibility of enslaving the Native American population. And then we talk about why specifically they chose Africans and why economically that it made sense at the time, why it happened the way that it did. So today what we're going to talk about is the second institution that I believe is at the core of the American experience, and that is the institution of religion. Now, when I say religion, what I mean as far as within the American context, what I'm really talking about is American Christianity specifically. There's a couple of different religious influences in America, and America's always had a very diverse religious population. But at the beginning, when we talk about American religion, we're talking about American Christianity. Now, American Christianity, of course, like all other American ideas and all other American institutions, is brought over and implemented by Europeans. American Christianity is deeply, and for obvious reasons, American Christianity is deeply influenced by the changes which have occurred in Europe before the arrival of Christopher Columbus, especially speaking the Protestant Reformation. So to talk about religion in early America, we have to take a step back first and look at the European influences which helped to shape American Christianity. So the major divide, the major issue in the 17th century is over Protestant, within Christianity, is over the split between the Protestants on the one hand and the Catholics on the other. So the Protestant Reformation occurs throughout the 14th, it begins in the 14th, occurs throughout the 15th century. So by the time of the foundation of America, by the time of the American Revolution in the 18th century, we already have many different divides, not only between Protestants and Catholics, but also in Protestantism itself. In Europe, Protestant and Catholics opposed each other and then divided amongst themselves as a consequence of the Protestant Reformation. Religious persecution is what drove several groups of settlers from Europe to the British North American colonies. There's a conviction amongst European Christianity that any nation has to have a conformity of belief. There's this idea that a nation must have religious singularity, that the nation as a whole, so European nations at this time would identify themselves as Protestant, and another nation might identify itself as Catholic or Lutheran or Calvinist, and eventually we have the establishment of the Church of England. So in Europe, there is no, this is an idea that's very familiar to us as Americans, but in Europe there is no separation of church and state. So when we talk about Protestantism coming over, we're talking about specific nationalities bringing their particular brand of Protestantism or Catholicism. So European religion is deeply intertwined with the government itself. For example, with the Church of England, the reason why it's called the Church of England is because it is a state-sponsored religious system. So all of these different national as well as religious divisions is inherited by the early Americans. However, unlike Europe, America has no one unified religious doctrine. America, from the get-go, is often viewed and understood to be a land of religious freedom, a land where people are, it is assumed that people can freely practice whatever religion, whatever denomination that it came to come from. And again, when I say religion, I'm meaning predominantly Christianity. There are some early Jewish settlers, but for the most part, we're talking, when I say religious liberty or religious freedom, I mean the differences in Christianity, specifically in Protestant Christianity, although Catholic settlers are also there from the get-go. So the key figures of the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, we have Martin Luther, who's operating in and around Germany. So Germany by this time is predominantly Lutheran. You also have John Calvin from Switzerland, and the Calvinist tradition, also referred to as, if you've ever heard it called the Reformed tradition. The Reformed tradition is the Calvinistic tradition, which also has a big influence in America. And of course, you have the formation of the Church of England. And when it comes to America, it's often referred to as the Anglican Church, an offshoot of that being the Episcopalian Church. So Americans, and what's distinctive about Protestant Christianity is there's this sort of corrosive element to it. Corrosive element in that there's a tendency in Protestant denominations to split, to break off from one another. This is why you have, I've lost count, probably around 1,000 different Protestant denominations. But Protestantism in this regard is sort of well suited for life in America, because Protestantism is going to emphasize the ability of each individual to read and to interpret the Bible for his or herself. Within the American context, this is going to set the stage for what's going to be the two sort of general movements within American religion, and that is the First and Second Great Awakening. So I say all this in short to say that the religious history of America, that America's inheriting a very complex and complicated religious history. The religion that comes to America, the Christianity that comes to America, is a Christianity that has a lot of baggage to it. So the American religious expression is very complicated. You have to look at, and it's almost impossible to look at all these different religious traditions that are going on here. So what instead we're going to focus on is the two different movements in American religion in the Great Awakening. Okay. So the two major religious events that shape American life are the First and the Second Great Awakening. The Great Awakening has its origins, again, it has its origins in Europe with the sort of religious fever that is sweeping throughout Europe, specifically throughout Britain, beginning with people like John Wesley, who are going to, and the Pietist tradition, Pietism, the Pietist tradition that begins in Germany, which is going to start to emphasize action and personal belief and emotion over and against the more rationalistic Christianity that emerged after the Enlightenment. So in a previous lecture, we talked about the Enlightenment, and I kind of briefly alluded to the effect that it had upon religion, especially the effect that it had upon Christianity. The Enlightenment's going to, one of the religious actions to the Enlightenment, people respond in two different ways. First of all, there's sort of the rationalistic response. Christian denominations which accept what the Enlightenment has to offer, accept this new interpretation of knowledge, this new sort of reasoning that the Enlightenment brings about, and they apply this new form of reasoning to theology, to the study of the Bible. And so you have a very rationalistic Christianity that emerges as a result of this. But you also have a reactionary branch of Christianity that, in reaction to this inherently rationalistic Christianity, tends to emphasize either action or emotion over reason. So you have an emphasis, for example, by John Wesley on action, on doing good works, on living a good moral life. That it doesn't necessarily matter what you necessarily believe about God. I mean, as long as you accept that Jesus has died for your sins, what really matters is that you live a good Christian life. So this, an emphasis on trusting the heart rather than trusting the head, right? An emphasis on feeling your religion, on doing good, acting good, on maintaining this sort of pure lifestyle. And the result of this is an emphasis on feeling and an emphasis on emotion rather than learning. What these people really wanted to do is they really wanted to feel God's presence, to seek God, right, with their heart, not necessarily with their reason. So you have this religious enthusiasm that begins in Britain and throughout Europe and eventually spreads into America, taking root at first in the New England area. By the 1740s, the clergymen of American churches were conducting these revivals that had been sweeping across Europe throughout the region of New England. What was characteristic of these revivals was that they contained emotionally charged sermons, which were all the more powerful because they were delivered by very animated pastors. Preachers like Jonathan Edwards, who would invoke vivid and terrifying images, who would talk about the completely depraved nature of humanity and the just, righteous anger of God. And this was a form of preaching a type of sermon that people weren't used to. We'll get more into this a bit later. But this is one of the reasons why the Great Awakening is so inviting to American listeners. This is why it spread so quickly, is because not so much the content of Christianity changes, but the method of delivery changes, amongst other things. The way, what it meant to be a Christian as far as your day-to-day life and as far as what you did in church and as far as how the pastor delivers their sermons, that changes. That changes, significantly so. So, what historians call the First Great Awakening. Well, let me back up a bit, okay? So the reason why these changes occur. So Christianity, a stage had been set. A trend had been set that sort of lent itself to revival, to the effectiveness of revival. So a number of conditions were actively available in the colonies at the beginning of the 18th century that would sort of set the stage for revival. First, as I talked about before, is this sort of arid rationalism. Churches in New England, especially the churches that had a Calvinistic bent, most of the time these were fairly dry sermons, fairly dry church services. So if you would go back in time and go into a church in New England at the time, everyone would be sitting there. Maybe you'd have some organ music or piano music. You would sing a few hymns. The pastor would get up there and literally read from his sermon. Read like this from his sermon. Go through each individual point without taking his eyes off the text and reading word for word. Because the idea was that this pastor was going to present the sermon to the congregation like a professional academic would present a well-researched paper. That he wanted to make sure that he clearly articulated all of his points and that the people rationally understood. And these revivals were going to present a new method of delivery for these sermons. So people, not everybody enjoyed these very dry, rationalistic sermons. So this is going to be the appeal of these revivals. And also, in America, you have a neglect of pastoral supervision, a lack of oversight, especially in the South. There's not a whole lot of church hierarchy in the South. So individual pastors are able to operate independently. And since they can operate independently, a lot of these pastors start to start to have revivals of their own and start to adopt the sort of preaching mechanism that becomes popular in the Great Awakening. So let's get to the First Great Awakening. What historians call the First Great Awakening can be described as a revitalization of religious piety that sweeps through the American colonies, beginning around the 1730s and the 1770s. Through the 1770s. The Second Great Awakening is going to begin about 100 years later. Well, we'll get to that. So in these Protestant cultures, what the Great Awakening is going to emphasize again, no new doctrines are being introduced, okay? It's not like the idea of Christianity is changing. Rather, what's going to change is the method. To be truly religious meant trusting with the heart rather than the head, prizing feeling over and against mere reason. So you're going to have these emotionally charged sermons. Now, there are two big figures that sort of shape the First Great Awakening. First of all, we have Jonathan Edwards, and secondly, we have George Whitefield. Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield. Now, out of the two, Edwards is the more theological, in the sense that Edwards is actually introducing some new theological ideas. He's actually a well-read, well-written gentleman. As we'll see, George Whitefield, his contributions is more in his ability to preach and his ability to draw large crowds and how he preached. Jonathan Edwards, you still have these rationalistic undertones, okay? Edwards wasn't an enigmatic, very charismatic figure. He's not jumping around, waving his hands. This is going to be George Whitefield. He's going to be known, as we'll see, for spicing things up a bit. Edwards, not so much. However, what Edwards does change is sort of the emphasis of his sermons. If you've ever heard of sinners in the hands of an angry God, this is a very famous Jonathan Edwards sermon. Edwards is going to focus on some different aspects of Christianity, such as what it actually meant to be virtuous, and an emphasis on faith, an emphasis on the individual's faith, about where you stood with God, individually speaking, about examining your own soul and where you were at in your relationship with God. What Edwards is also going to do is he's also going to he's going to give a moral critique of New England society. Edwards blamed New England's moral ills on its assumption of religious and moral self-sufficiency. Basically, Edwards believed that the Christian church had become much like the Pharisees of the New Testament, that they'd become sort of self-righteous, that they believed that they had all the answers, that they were confident in their moral ability. And so what Edwards is going to say is that you shouldn't have this sort of confidence, that you are a sinner, that you have fallen short of goodness, that you have that you're morally corruptible. And as a result, you face God's judgment. So there's no reason to be self-confident, according to Edwards. So you see this sort of different emphasis that Edwards is placing. Edwards insisted that true religion lies in holy love, a love that provides its genuineness in its inner quality and practical results. So that the believer in faith, that is going to show his faith through his practical results, and that religion ought to revolve around the believer's love for God. Up next, we have George Whitefield. So Whitefield, unlike Edwards, Whitefield's more of a preacher. He's going to change the way in which American pastors deliver their sermons and the way in which American pastors reach out to the community. So Whitefield didn't really care too much about denomination. He wasn't really concerned with what sort of church he was preaching at, what the beliefs of that church were. Whitefield was more concerned with bringing people to Christ. Whitefield highly emphasizes a new idea that began in Christianity at the time that was becoming more and more popular, and this is the idea of a new birth. Whitefield wanted people to be saved. Whitefield claims that he experienced a new birth while he was in college. And so this is an idea that's going to stick with American Christianity in particular. It's an idea that's still with us today in many ways. Whitefield said that he grew up a Christian, that he was kind of all, brought up within the Christian tradition, knew the general tenets of Christianity, but that it wasn't until he was saved that he actually had a relationship with God. And so Whitefield, in this sense, is trying to wake Christians up, to get them to experience the new birth. And this idea of a new birth comes from the gospel accounts of Nicodemus speaking with Jesus, when Jesus says that you must be born again. And so Whitefield's going to tell people that they must experience this new birth, a rebirth in Jesus. So what's distinctive about Whitefield, unlike other pastors at the time, Whitefield's going to preach to any and everybody. He's going to preach on street corners. He's going to preach in churches if they let them come. If they let him come into this church, he's going to preach in the marketplace. He's going to preach wherever. Whitefield's not going to read from a sheet of paper like most pastors. He's not just going to stand up there and give his points. Rather, Whitefield studied a bit of drama in his college days, and so he's going to memorize his sermon, and he's going to be very animated. He's going to be moving his arms around, using hand gestures, yelling to the crowd, trying to emphasize certain points. And this is going to he's going to get a very positive reaction to this. Whitefield's going to draw large crowds. He's going to preach outdoors. In 1740, Whitefield begins his career in England. In 1740, he brings this new preaching style and his new defiance of church authority. Again, Whitefield doesn't care about denominations. He doesn't care about getting church memberships, which starts to make some people upset. Okay, he's not going to care about whether or not people are saying their catechisms correctly or anything like that. He just wants people to be saved. So a lot of times Whitefield would go over the heads of the local church pastors and preach to their congregations, which some pastors believe that he was trying to steal their congregations. Whitefield's also one of the first pastors to use media. Media is something that is emerging during this time period due to the new technological changes in communications. Newspapers were very popular back then. Newspapers were widely read, especially in colonial America. So one of the things that Whitefield would do is he would advertise. He would plan in advance. So he would say, okay, in 3 months I'm going to Boston. So he would start to put ads in the Boston newspaper to announce his arrival, to tell people he was coming, to market himself. And this was something that preachers hadn't really done until then. right? If you were a new preacher, you would come into town and set up your church, and your church itself would be the advertisement. What Whitefield does is he uses the media to his advantage, and as a result of this, he draws really large crowds. And again, he has a different preaching style. And his central theme for a lot of his messages is going to be the theme of salvation. What must an individual do to be saved? And again, this isn't something new. This isn't introducing any sort of new idea to Christian theology. But what is new is how Whitefield did this. Again, drawing on his past experience in theater, Whitefield memorized his sermon, spoke without notes, varied the level of his voice, emphasized different aspects, and gestured with his hands. And crowds responded likewise. Crowds responded with an outpouring of emotion. People just ate this stuff up. And what he also produces is a sort of spiritual revival, a new way to experience God's presence. So in this way, one of the implications that results from the First Great Awakening is that it changes how people in America experience God. Instead of receiving religious instructions from their ministers, ordinary men and women unleash their emotions to make an immediate, intense, and personal connection with the divine. So what starts to happen is you start to have an emphasis on personal salvation. Now, personal salvation had always been an aspect of Christianity. But what starts to be emphasized is your own personal conversion experience. And usually this conversion experience was marked with some sort of emotional response. Whether it's weeping, people would fall out, they would fall down to the ground. People would laugh, they'd cry, they'd dance, whatever. Your conversion experience was marked with some sort of flood of emotions. And this started to become characteristic of these revivals that were starting to occur around America. All right, so now let's move on to the Second Great Awakening. Second Great Awakening. The first half of the 19th century witnessed a dramatic expansion of a religious movement that started 100 years earlier in England and Scotland. So now we have again, it's coming from Europe, coming from England and Scotland, and this is the evangelical movement. Evangelists spread the word that Christ's death and resurrection had freed sinners from their shackles and had reconciled them with God. They preached this message in meetings called revivals, where they proclaimed that the believer's fledgling faith could be revived to a vigorous new life. So here we have a difference between the First Great Awakening. This is why we would distinguish between the First Great Awakening on the one hand and the Second Great Awakening on the other. The First Great Awakening, although you have new methods of preaching, the preachers would, as far as their theology goes, as far as what they were preaching, it's nothing really new. Sure, Whitefield would use the media in his sermons and draw large crowds, but Whitefield was still essentially operating out of the Reformed Calvinistic tradition. So was Jonathan Edwards. The First Great Awakening, men and women received salvation in a sort of passive sense. And this gets back to a doctrine within the Reformed tradition of predestination. The idea behind predestination is the notion that God has already predestined some for salvation and some for damnation. That God already has in mind who is saved. And that there's nothing that you as an individual can really do about that. So preachers during the first Great Awakening, they were trying to reach out to the elect. They were trying to get the message to those people who needed to be saved, who God had already predestined for heaven. They had to get the message to those people. So salvation in the first Great Awakening was more passive in that regard. You were already saved. God had already planned for you to be saved. You were supposed to be at this revival so that way you could hear this message. This changes, and this may seem like a slight change to you, but it's a big theological shift. The evangelical movement is going to emphasize the individual's response to the gospel. In other words, salvation becomes active. It's an active process. It's something that the individual has to actively pursue. It's not something that you can passively receive. It's something that you actively have to go after. So this changes the theological tenor of the Second Great Awakening. Now, the Second Great Awakening is going to begin in America at roughly around the same time, but in two different places. It's going to begin in the Kentucky, Tennessee area, and it's going to spread, and it's also going to begin about the same time. Excuse me. Sorry for you listening to that. I was trying to stop myself from sneezing, but I couldn't. So it's going to begin in the Kentucky, Tennessee area, and it's also going to begin about the same time in southern New England. As far as what makes the Second Great Awakening, we talked about what makes it theologically distinctive. Practically speaking, what makes it distinctive is that the Second Great Awakening is going to introduce to American Christianity the camp meeting. The camp meeting. A prime example of this is the Cane Ridge Revival, which was probably one of the most famous religious meetings in American history. A camp meeting took place outdoors, away from one's home, away from one's community, at some isolated campsite. And the idea behind this was you'd get away from your job, get away from your community, and you would spend a few days worshiping. You would just spend a few days isolated from everything and everybody else, and all you would do during these few days, you would have intense worship services. You would have a preacher come that would deliver a salvation message. So very intense religious meetings, intense preaching, and people would often respond during these camp meetings with very deep emotion. The Cane Ridge Revival is unique because it's one of the first examples that we have, one of the first recorded examples that we have of camp meetings. And it's one of the first camp meetings that we have in which we see what would become a characteristic response, characteristic emotional response. We have one observer who describes the Cane Ridge camp meeting in this way. This is what he has to say. Some said that they feel the approaching symptoms by being under deep conviction. Their heart swells, their nerves relax, and in an instant they become motionless and speechless. It comes upon others like an electric shock, as if it felt in the great arteries of the arms or thighs. The body relaxes and falls motionless. People fall to the ground. The hands and the feet become cold, and yet the pulse is as formerly. The pulse is normal. They're still alive, but they're falling out. They're falling to the ground. They are all opposed to any medical application. They will continue in that state from 1 hour to 24. So at the Cane Ridge Revival, you have this deeply emotional and physical response. Some people weep. Some people are dancing around. Some people, it's even reported, they get on their hands and their knees and they start barking like dogs. Some people fall out. Some people are shaking. Some people fall asleep. All sorts of different emotional responses that is nowadays characteristic of evangelical Christianity, if you're familiar with it. These camp meetings soon become popular all around the colonial America. Soon hundreds of camp meetings of various lengths and intensity erupted throughout America. This evangelical revival throughout America is also going to leave some very important legacies. It's going to shape American society and American politics in some very important ways. First of all is going to be the role for women. The role for women. The role that women played within the church and the status that women were given in society. Evangelicalism is going to reject any sort of hierarchical church doctrine. Well, it's not necessarily, I guess I shouldn't say that it's going to reject it. It's not going to emphasize it. What evangelicals are going to emphasize is the personal experience of God and your own personal salvation story. So in this regard, men and women are equal because both men and women can be saved. And both men and women have a story to share. Both men and women can share their own personal testimony. So the evangelical church is going to give women a lot more leeway than was normally allowed in other American denominations. Women are allowed the opportunity to speak in front of a congregation. Women hold leadership positions throughout the evangelical movement. Women are singing in the revival. They're setting up the locations of these camp meetings. They're conducting these camp meetings. They're playing a very important role, a role that was typically regulated to men. So you have a new role for women. Also, it's going to be in these radical evangelical groups that you're going to have the support of the anti-slavery movement. The anti-slavery movement begins as a religious movement in these evangelical groups. The idea that all people, both men and women, black and white, we all have the same experience, the same offer of salvation, right? God doesn't speak to an African in one way and speak to a white person in another way. It's all the same. He doesn't speak to a woman in one way and a man in another. Right? The offer of salvation goes out to everybody. And everybody has the opportunity to experience this, and everybody ought to share this experience. So the anti-slavery movement owes its origins, in many ways it owes its origins to this evangelical Christianity. And also, finally, for those of you who are interested, we have a new tradition of evangelical singing. A lot of new music comes out of this time period, new styles of music as well. So what allowed this to happen? Historically, what were the causes that made it possible for the first and second Great Awakening to occur? There are many different reasons. I'm going to point to a few that I think are important, that some historians have suggested. One is to see the evangelical message as a response to a deeply felt need for order, following the disorder of the Revolutionary War and the disorder of frontier society. Evangelical preaching brought a sense of regularity to individuals' lives and provided ties of friendship and love and a sense of community especially a sense of community in these sort of frontier towns, these sort of towns on the Appalachian border, in which people might feel disconnected from the rest of society. So perhaps part of the reason for the success of this was due to this sort of psychological need for order. Another reason may also be the rising tides in America of this sort of democratic feeling. This democratic feeling is going to be present in America ever since and before the American Revolution. The idea that the government gets its power from the people, that the king, the president, whoever is not put there by God, that the only reason why he has that power is because we, the people, allow him to have that power. And you see this start to be reflected in the churches. Instead of having these big hierarchical organizations, these churches that are led from the top down, instead what you have is the rise of congregationalist churches, churches that are built by, maintained, and operated by the people. The people decide who they're going to elect to be their pastor. The people decide when and where the church is built, when the church meets. So it's a democratic feeling that each person can have their own individual experience of God. Individuals held themselves responsible for their behavior and thus for their destiny. The idea that we could decide to be saved it may also be linked to this sort of democratic feeling. And also just due to the personalities that were there. People like Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield, highly charismatic individuals that were able to rile up these large crowds. A lot of the success is due to these men. Right? We don't want to take anything away from them. Okay. In conclusion, the Second Great Awakening, the First and Second Great Awakening are going to mark a fundamental transition in American religious life. It's going to shape American Christianity in such a way that's still with us today. Right? A lot of these things, the emphasis on personal salvation, the emphasis on emotion, the emphasis on each person understanding the Bible for themselves, a lot of this is still characteristic of Christianity today. What's also going to happen is you're going to have social movements spring from this. Okay, there's an emphasis on personal action and on personal piety. So what people are going to start doing is they're going to start turning their attention to the community. So in many ways, this religious revival, not only is this revival going to shape Christianity, but it's going to start to shape society and start to shape politics as well. All right, thank you for tuning in, and I look forward to speaking with you next time.